The table had 12 seats, but it still felt too empty. It had been exactly 1 year since Evelyn passed, and I had planned this quiet lunch to mark what would have been her 72nd birthday. Nothing grand, just the family she spent her life building. I'd reserved a private room at her favorite garden bistro, the one with the climbing ivy walls and the little white string lights she loved watching flicker as dusk settled in. I arrived early, as I always did when it came to things about her. I set out the napkin rings she had embroidered herself decades ago, the ones with tiny initials stitched in blue thread, one for each of us. Her handwriting still lived on in those loops and crosses, in the uneven but loving care with which she sewed everyone's name into soft linen. A small frame sat at the center of the table, holding her photograph from our 30th anniversary, the one where she wore that impossibly loud turquoise shawl, because she said it made her feel like a peacock. She was radiant, and so alive. One by one, they arrived. My eldest, Elizabeth, with her husband who never looked me in the eye. My grandson Aaron, now taller than all of us and already forgetting how to say please. Then Charlotte, my youngest, the one Evelyn called her shadow until she wasn't anymore. She strolled in late, sunglasses still on, dragging behind her a scent that reminded me of too much money and not enough silence. She kissed the air beside my cheek like a stranger in a movie, then took her seat across from me, the furthest point from Evelyn's photo. The food was good. I barely touched mine. Conversation stumbled like it always did when people try to sound interested in lives they don't listen to. Someone mentioned stocks, someone else divorce. Elizabeth scrolled through her phone under the table, while nodding absently at whatever her son was saying. I kept glancing at Evelyn's picture, as if at any moment she might turn and smile. I tried to hold on to the warmth she used to give every room, but I could feel the light dimming under the weight of politeness and noise. Then Charlotte leaned back in her chair, wine glass dangling from fingers that had never once touched a dish towel. Her laugh was sharp, sudden. "You know," she said, loud enough to pierce through every plate and fork and breath, "you really should have died instead of her. It didn't come with malice. Not directly." She said it like a joke, a little performance for the others, punctuated by a smirk and the flick of her hair over one shoulder. Elizabeth's husband barked out a laugh before catching my eye and swallowing it whole. Aaron chuckled, then looked away. Elizabeth just sighed, like it was an inside joke she didn't want to explain. No one said a word in protest. No one asked her to take it back. No one looked at the photograph in the center of the table, which somehow now seemed heavier than all the plates combined. I felt my chest tighten, not from anger, not even from pain, but from the sheer density of silence that followed. I had spent a year shrinking myself into grief, learning how to breathe in the space Evelyn left behind. I had taught myself not to expect kindness anymore, but I had not expected cruelty. Not like this. Not from the child Evelyn once sang lullabies to during thunderstorms. Not from the girl who once cried when she saw me cry for the first time. But people change, and grief doesn't just expose what's broken, it reveals who broke it. I reached into my coat pocket. My hand touched the edge of the envelope I had placed there hours earlier. I had debated giving it to her today, or waiting for a more private moment. But now, the time had chosen itself. I stood up slowly, clearing my throat to regain the weight of my voice, and walked around the table until I stood beside Charlotte. She looked up, still amused, still riding the high of attention. I placed the envelope in front of her, firm and unblinking. "What's this?" she said, half laughing, expecting a retort or a birthday card for the dead. But as her fingers slid the flap open, and her eyes traced the first few lines of legal text inside, something in her expression changed. Her mouth didn't move, but her smile vanished like someone had erased it with a single breath. She flipped through the rest of the document page after page, notarized and sealed, final and irreversible. The room shifted. Elizabeth leaned over the peak, then drew back sharply. Aaron asked something, but no one answered. Charlotte's hands trembled slightly as she looked at me. This isn't. It is, I said quietly, returning to my seat. And it's been filed for 3 weeks now. No one spoke for a full minute. Not even the servers dared approach with dessert. Evelyn's picture watched all of us, frozen in the joy of a life spent giving, while her daughter sat staring at a document that took all her taking away. That moment, that envelope wasn't a revenge. It was the silence that followed, the realization, the first crack in a world she thought she controlled. The next steps had already been set in motion, but this was the beginning, not of spite but of clarity. The slow unraveling of every thread she once used to tie herself to a legacy she never earned. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to get angry. All I had to do was let her see what love looks like, when it remembers who cherished it and who only showed up when it was gone. And as Charlotte sat frozen, the laughter long gone, I finally felt something I hadn't in months: peace. Because the past cannot be replaced, but justice can be arranged. The sound of paper had never carried so much weight, but I could still hear it in my memory, the slight rasp as Charlotte turned each page of the will, her fingers slowing with every clause, every signature. That envelope had landed like thunder, and though the storm passed quietly in the restaurant, it never really ended. It simply changed locations. By the time the lunch had broken up in awkward murmurs and sidelong glances, the sky outside had begun to dim, as if the world itself understood that something old had ended, and something older had been reborn in its place. That night, I sat alone in the living room, Evelyn's chair across from mine, her whereupon throw blanket still draped over the armrest. I didn't cry. I hadn't since the day she passed. My tears had dried into action, and every detail of that document Charlotte now clutched in her designer handbag had been the fruit of careful, deliberate labor. I had rewritten the will the same week I heard Charlotte call Evelyn's illness convenient. I remembered the exact words. "At least now Dad will stop obsessing over her," she told Elizabeth on the phone, thinking I was asleep. "She's been dragging this out for months." Evelyn was still alive then, still breathing in the other room, still trying to hold on. But Charlotte had already buried her in her mind, like a task completed, a wall cleared from her path. I didn't confront her then. I just watched her walk through our house without looking at the pictures on the walls, without asking how Evelyn was doing, without once folding her voice into the softness grief required. I waited, and in that waiting, I began to write. The new will was precise, clean, immune to misinterpretation. My attorney, a man who had watched our children grow up and had once coached Charlotte's debate team, looked at me over his glasses as I read it aloud. "You sure about this, Walter?" he asked. I nodded. "They'll contest it," he warned. I nodded again. He made no more objections. Only the loyal ones had access now. Elizabeth, who had stayed by Evelyn's side even when silence filled the room heavier than words. Her 2 sons, who had helped with groceries and refused to let Evelyn feel small in her final days. And someone else, someone forgotten. A girl named May, barely mentioned in our family conversations, barely acknowledged by Charlotte her entire life. May was Evelyn's goddaughter, her niece by blood but more like a second daughter by soul. Her mother had died young. Evelyn had helped raise her, braided her hair, taken her to the dentist when no one else had time. Charlotte hated her, claimed May was the charity case who wouldn't leave, but Evelyn loved her, and so did I quietly, from a distance, because May never asked for anything. She just showed up, with soup, with flowers, with a soft voice, and no expectations. When I asked her once why she came so often, she looked confused. "She's family," she said, like it was the simplest truth in the world. In the new will, every asset, every savings account, every piece of real estate, Every painting Evelyn had cherished went to Elizabeth and May. 50-50. Not out of favoritism. Out of memory. Charlotte got nothing. No caveats. No fallback clause. No sentimental jewelry buried at the end. Just one sentence that read, "Charlotte will receive no portion of the estate due to estrangement, irreconcilable cruelty, and her documented contempt toward both her parents." My lawyer had warned me that the phrasing might invite dispute. I insisted it remain. I wanted the truth inked into something permanent, something a judge could read and understand that this was not revenge, it was record-keeping. I had filed the will 3 weeks before the birthday lunch. Everything had been transferred legally, witnessed, finalized. The envelope I handed her at that table wasn't a warning. It was a tombstone for her illusions. The next morning, she called. I let it ring. Then she texted, "We need to talk. This isn't fair. I need to understand what this is." There was no question mark, just demands dressed in soft language. I didn't reply. By noon, she was calling my lawyer instead, and by late afternoon, I received an email forwarded from his office. Charlotte had formally requested a copy of the will and stated her intention to challenge it. She claimed mental instability on my part, that I had been manipulated in my grief, that Evelyn had poisoned my mind against her. It made me laugh bitterly to see how quickly she reached for words she used to mock when Evelyn said them herself. How often had she told her mother to stop being dramatic when Evelyn cried? How many times had she told me that I was too sentimental when I refused to sell the piano? Evelyn played every morning. Now that same sentimentality had carved her out of everything she thought was hers. By the end of that week, she had gone from fury to bargaining. A new message arrived, this time handwritten, delivered by courier. It was addressed not to me, but to Dad. Just that 3 letters she hadn't used in years unless followed by a demand. The note inside tried a different tone. She didn't mention the will. She didn't apologize either. She wrote, "I know we've had our differences, but I was hoping Mom's birthday could bring us together. I guess I said something dumb. I didn't mean it like that. I miss her too. Please, let's talk." I stared at the note for a long time. Not because I believed it, but because I wanted to feel what I used to feel. Paternal instinct, doubt, that quiet urge to protect your child, even from herself. But there was nothing, no spark. Only the image of Evelyn in her final days, asking me with shaking hands not to let Charlotte turn our memory into a transaction. So I kept the letter, but I didn't answer it. I placed it in a drawer where I had kept Evelyn's last grocery list, still clipped to the fridge by a ceramic magnet shaped like a pear. Charlotte didn't know that grief doesn't make people blind. It makes them see. It reveals who stood beside you when everything else fell. And while the world outside kept spinning, and lawyers kept drafting replies, I sat in silence, surrounded by the echoes of Evelyn's laughter, and the truth that no court could undo what Charlotte herself had buried long before I ever put pen to paper. She thought legacy was something you claimed, but legacy isn't claimed. It's earned, breath by breath, choice by choice. And hers, whatever she imagined it to be, was already gone. The day after she found out she was no longer part of the will, the mail arrived late. A rainstorm had drenched the pavement and turned the driveways into mirrors, catching every inch of sky and sorrow above them. Charlotte was staying at her boyfriend's place, a sterile penthouse far removed from the creaking floors and warm corners of the home Evelyn once made. She had expected the day to be quiet, maybe a call from a lawyer, a dramatic message from me, something she could spin back into control. But instead, the knock on the door was dull, patient, and final. A small, square package sat waiting on the marble tiles of the lobby, plain except for the return address written in my handwriting. But it wasn't from me. Not really. It was from Evelyn. From the grave. Almost. A gift and a reckoning in one. Charlotte held the box like it might bite. She tore at the tape, irritated, already expecting it to be some other insult. But inside she found only a flat folder, wrapped in one of Evelyn's old scarves, white, with a fading violet pattern, the kind Evelyn always wore to church when her hair had begun to fall from the treatments. The scent lingered, faintly floral but not perfume, just memory. Charlotte hesitated. For a moment, the edge cracked. A sliver of something real passed over her eyes. But then her jaw tightened again, and she unfolded the fabric like it was evidence, not intimacy. Inside, a single sheet of aged paper, handwritten in blue ink, her mother's script unmistakable. At the top, her name, Charlotte. Not my dearest, not honey, just Charlotte. The letter was dated 3 years ago, months before Evelyn had passed, sealed and marked in my wife's handwriting, to be delivered only if she crosses the line. She read it standing, her fingers trembling just slightly. The first lines weren't poetic. Evelyn had never been one for flourishes. She had always spoken plainly, especially when she was in pain. The letter began with a memory, Charlotte's 3rd birthday, the way she had clapped when the candles were lit, the way she had kissed Evelyn on the cheek without being told. Then it shifted. Evelyn wrote about the changes, how over time, Charlotte's affection turned conditional. Her voice sharpened, her visits shorter. She wrote about the way Charlotte rolled her eyes when Evelyn asked for help with groceries, the way she spoke over her, corrected her, mocked her when she forgot details because of the medication. And then, Evelyn did something neither of us had ever dared aloud. She named the cruelty. She said, "I fear you do not love me as I am, only as I am useful. And I'm afraid that when I am gone, you will rewrite me into a version that serves you." The lines cut deeper than any lawyer's draft. But Evelyn was not angry. She was tired, and in that exhaustion, she had found a kind of quiet courage. The next paragraph was the one that made Charlotte sit down. It said, "Your father will outlive me. He is stronger than he lets on. If you ever speak to him with the same venom you've used on me, he will not forgive you the way I did. And he shouldn't. If you mock his grief, you will lose more than money. You will lose the last bridge back to anything real." Evelyn's warning wasn't a threat. It was a prophecy, and Charlotte had fulfilled it, word for word. At that table, with her smile and her laughter and the sentence that poisoned the air, "You should have died instead of her." Evelyn didn't hear it, but she had predicted it. Somehow, she knew that when kindness ran out, Charlotte would use mockery to fill the space. She had prepared this letter not out of vengeance, but out of reluctant understanding. At the end of the page, Evelyn had written one final line. "If this letter is in your hands, it means you chose cruelty over memory. And now, you must live with what you've taken from yourself. No signature, no closing, just an empty space at the bottom, like a grave waiting to be filled." Charlotte stared at it for a long time. Then, with a sudden jerk, she stood and rushed to the kitchen. She opened the drawer where her boyfriend kept a lighter, the kind used for candles or cigars. She flicked it once, then twice, but her hands trembled and the flame wouldn't stay. She cursed under her breath, fumbling, desperate to make a catch. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the scarf. Maybe it was the paper's age, how fragile it had become. Or maybe it was the dawning realization that burning it wouldn't erase what it said. That fire doesn't eat guilt, it only turns it into smoke. She let the letter fall onto the table, her face pale, her breath sharp. The next day, the scarf and letter were found folded neatly in the building's trash chute, resting atop an untouched bag of organic vegetables. Not burned, just discarded. But the contents had already been photographed, already archived, already made part of the larger truth. I knew she would try to get rid of it. That's why I made copies. The original had gone to her. One was kept with my lawyer. Another was sealed with the executor of Evelyn's memorial trust. And just one, was framed and placed quietly in a new hallway. where young women at the shelter now walk every morning on their way to fresh beginnings. Charlotte's words might have drawn laughter, but Evelyn's words drew legacy. The kind that doesn't flinch under pressure. The kind that outlives every shallow joke. And as Charlotte sat alone that night, rereading the lines she could no longer pretend were lies, I sat beneath the old oak in our backyard, a candle lit beneath the stars. Not for Evelyn, she needed no tribute, but for the version of Charlotte we once hoped would grow into someone kind. A version that died long before the will, long before the letter, maybe even before the first time she rolled her eyes at the woman who raised her. The letter had never been meant to punish. It had been meant to save. But some people see lifelines as ropes, and they cut them. The morning after the letter, Charlotte returned to what she believed was her last bastion of power. The house. Not just a house, but the housebreak in oak, ivy-wrapped. The place where she was born and where Evelyn had once painted the front door, a ridiculous shade of seafoam green just to annoy the neighbors. It was the house where birthdays were held, where lemonade was poured on Sunday afternoons, where every argument had an echo and every silence held a memory. And Charlotte believed fiercely, foolishly, that it would always be hers. In her mind, no matter what the will said, no matter what envelopes or letters or public disgrace had fallen her way, this house was immutable. The law could argue, the past could not. She'd grown up in those walls. She had shouted in those rooms. She had once called it home. But what she didn't understand was that roots can rot and blood doesn't always mean belonging. She arrived unannounced, which was her habit. There was no knock, no call ahead, just the hum of her leased SUV pulling into the familiar gravel drive. But something was off before she even reached the front steps. The shutters had been repainted a deeper, richer shade of burgundy. The front garden, once overgrown and sagging with Evelyn's roses, was now structured, clean, humble. The grass no longer grew wild beneath the mailbox where Evelyn used to drop notes to the mailman. The mailbox itself had been replaced. Its paint was fresh, the handle polished, and where their family name once curled in brass letters, there was now a simple plaque. Charlotte squinted. It read, "The Evelyn Grace Haven." The words landed in her throat like gravel. She didn't need to ask what it meant. She just didn't want it to be true. She walked to the door and reached for the knob, expecting resistance, but hoping it hadn't yet come to that. It had. The door didn't budge. Her key no longer worked. In fact, the entire knob had been changed. She banged on the wood once, twice, louder. A soft-eyed woman opened it, early 40s, wearing a faded cardigan and a name tag that read Lena. Behind her, 3 younger women stood cautiously in the foyer, holding cups of tea and watching from a respectful distance. Charlotte spoke first, sharp and rehearsed, as if the very act of articulating her demand would reverse whatever had been done. "This is my house," she said. "You need to leave." The woman's face did not shift into fear or apology. Instead, Lena offered a calm, practiced smile and said, "Actually, ma'am, this house now belongs to the Evelyn Grace Memorial Shelter. I'm the director. We moved in last Thursday." And with that, the door closed, not rudely, but with the softness of someone trained not to escalate conflict. Charlotte stood on the porch for several minutes, stunned, her hands still hovering in the air, as if waiting for permission to finish a gesture that no longer mattered. She paced, she yelled, she threatened legal action, but all of it fell flat because I had done everything right. Months earlier, after the final oncologist visit and before Evelyn's last breath, we had sat together and planned something radical, not for revenge, for restoration. We would turn the home where she had once lost herself into a place where others could rebuild theirs. We established the transfer quietly, filing all the necessary documents. The house had been removed from our personal estate and placed into a private trust. Under a non-profit charter, a board had been formed, bylaws written, funds allocated. By the time Charlotte walked up those steps, the house was no longer a home in her name. It was a refuge in Evelyn's. Inside, the living room was now a communal space. The upstairs bedrooms turned into safe, clean quarters for women escaping lives of silence and fists. The hallway held framed photos of Evelyn, not posed but candid, her reading to a child at church, her holding a broken toaster in laughter, her arms around to volunteers at the food bank. Her laugh was there, visible in pixels, real in a way no inheritance could bottle. In what used to be Charlotte's childhood bedroom, a young mother from a nearby shelter now read aloud to her daughter each night, both of them safe for the first time in years. The floorboards still creaked the same. The air still smelled faintly of cinnamon and dust. But the stories had changed. The house had not died. It had been reborn. Charlotte called her lawyer that afternoon, desperate to unwind what had been done. But there was nothing to reverse. The transfer had taken place before the final will. It was legal, airtight, and irrevocable. She tried the press next, but no one was interested in airing the grievances of a daughter who had mocked her mother's memory and lost her share. The local newspaper had already published a small article welcoming the shelter, praising its mission and citing Evelyn's name with reverence. She was no longer just a woman who had died of cancer. She was a founder, a patron, a protector. And Charlotte was just a woman locked out of a house where she used to live. Later that evening, I stood by the back fence, watching as Charlotte sat alone in her idling SUV, staring at the house she had tried to claim with entitlement rather than grace. She didn't notice me, or maybe she did and chose not to react. Eventually, she drove off, tires hissing against the wet gravel. I turned back toward the house and walked the garden path Evelyn used to tend with gloved hands and quiet humming. Lena waved to me from the kitchen window. I nodded. The lights inside were warm. The laughter of children drifted faintly into the air. The house was full again, but not of inheritance, of healing. And the woman who once mocked love had been replaced quietly, legally, permanently by those who knew how to hold it with care. Charlotte had always believed in the permanence of money, not in the sense of earning it, but in the certainty that it would always be there, waiting like a loyal dog at the back door, tail wagging, tongue lolling, no matter how many times she kicked it. She had treated wealth as an entitlement, not a resource. Since her early 20s, the trust fund had been a silent provider, cushioning her every poor decision in layers of inherited softness, like falling backward into a bed she never made. She never asked how the money stayed replenished. She never wondered about the quiet documents Evelyn and I spent late nights signing. She just spent on things that gleamed, things that sparkled under artificial lights, things that cost more than they offered. And each time the monthly allowance landed in her account, she greeted it not with gratitude, but with boredom. So when she woke up that morning, still vibrating with fury over the house she could no longer call hers, she opened her banking app with the intention of retreating into one of her last remaining sanctuaries, transaction-based therapy. But the balance, usually robust, sat quietly at zero. At first, she thought it was a glitch. She refreshed the app, restarted her phone, logged out, logged in. Nothing changed. The line of zeros stood like tombstones. She called the bank, expecting deference, expecting that familiar edge of customer service politeness that always bent to her demands. But the woman on the other end, a soft-voiced clerk named Melissa, explained with measured detachment that the account had been emptied in accordance with new instructions filed 3 days prior. "You'll want to speak to the trustee," she said. "It's all been authorized and properly documented. I can send over a copy if you'd like." Charlotte didn't respond. She simply hung up and stared at her reflection. In the black screen of her phone, her own eyes looking back, wide with a dawning that looked very much like fear. She drove to the office of the family's estate attorney next, The same one who had once called her Miss Hawthorne with an almost exaggerated flourish. But this time, he greeted her with outstanding. There were no handshakes, no flattery. Just a man in a dark suit placing a folder gently on his desk and pushing it toward her, like a quiet eulogy. Inside were the new directives, signed by me, notarized, legally sealed and above dispute. The trust fund, once reserved for Evelyn's direct descendants, had been modified. Its contents had been entirely rerouted to a new initiative, a scholarship for orphaned girls in Evelyn's hometown. The fund would now sponsor their education, housing, and well-being until they reached adulthood. A full pipeline from shelter to school to safety, carved from the marrow of what was once Charlotte's financial cushion. She read the papers in stunned silence, lips parting only slightly as she stumbled over the name of the foundation, the Evelyn Grace Resilience Fund, the same name that now hung above the door of the house she could no longer enter. Her inheritance had become hope, and not for her. The attorney, sensing her silence curling into something volatile, cleared his throat and added, "Your father thought long and hard about this. He came to us months before Evelyn passed. It was her idea, really. She didn't want her legacy tied up in objects and bitterness. She wanted it to move." Charlotte snapped. "So he gave it away." The attorney didn't flinch. He gave it purpose. And that was perhaps the first time in her life someone corrected her without fear. She left without another word. That night, I sat alone in my study, the same room where I had once read bedtime stories and filled out tax forms, with Evelyn snoring softly beside me on the couch. The silence was thick, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that follows a necessary ending, like the quiet after a fire has burned itself out. The lamp cast a warm halo over the framed photo of Evelyn on my desk, her face radiant, frozen in a laugh I had long since memorized. I thought about the letters we had written together, the plans she had made while her hands trembled, her voice growing weaker each day, but her convictions sharpening like glass. She didn't want revenge. She wanted dignity for herself, for me, and for any girl who might one day need a place to stand. And I had promised her I would make that happen. Somewhere across town, Charlotte was likely combing through old emails, trying to find a loophole, some stray clause that would swing the pendulum back in her favor. But there were none. Every path had been closed. Every door she thought belonged to her had been repurposed. Her name was still hers, but everything it had once commanded now belonged to others who needed it more, others who would never mock a widow's grief for applause. In the coming days, she tried to rally sympathy, painting herself as the victim of betrayal. She told friends I had been manipulated, that I was losing it, that grief had driven me mad. But no one bought it, not after the birthday lunch, not after what she had said. The world had seen her laugh at death and stare down her father with a smile that could only be called cruel. They remembered. The memory of a single moment can weigh heavier than a lifetime of excuses. I didn't respond to her messages. I didn't need to. Some punishments don't require shouting. They simply require absence. And in the absence of money, of legacy, of shelter, of applause, Charlotte was finally alone. Not because I banished her, but because she had mocked the very thing that had once held her close. She had laughed at love, and now love no longer listened. The invitation arrived in a simple white envelope, addressed not to a person but to a memory. It was the annual community gala, an event Evelyn and I had attended for decades, once side by side, then after she passed just me in a chair left half empty. This year, they asked to dedicate a segment in her honor, to show a small tribute video. Nothing elaborate, just a few photos, perhaps a word or two from those she had touched. I agreed, though I didn't say much in return. I had already said all my words to Evelyn, spoken them in empty rooms, whispered them into folded letters, etched them into decisions my daughter now considered betrayal. But the town remembered Evelyn for who she was, not through the lens of her daughter's disdain, but as a woman who gave before she asked, who listened more than she spoke, who knew every name at the market and every hurt in the eyes of strangers. That night, I wore the suit Evelyn liked most, charcoal gray, with the cufflinks she'd given me on our 40th anniversary, and stepped into the ballroom, as though stepping back into the world she had once helped shape. The air inside was soft with the hush of conversation, the kind of warmth that clings to gatherings built on memory rather than obligation. Strings played softly in the background. Faces I hadn't seen in years smiled with a gentleness reserved for those who grieve out loud and survive anyway. I sat near the back. I didn't want to be the center of attention. I just wanted to see her face again. When the lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life, there was no announcement, no speech, no drum roll, just a photograph. Evelyn, in the garden, her hands deep in soil, her face turned toward a light source just out of frame. Then another, her cradling our first daughter, who would later learn cruelty but was once held with reverence. Then clips, her laughing while trying to ice a cake that kept falling apart. Dancing in the living room with slippers on the wrong feet. Brushing my hair while pretending she could still see clearly enough to find the part. Laughter, music, sunshine, her essence, caught in fragments. But it wasn't the past that shifted the room. It was the future she had prepared for, quietly, privately, with a kind of bravery I hadn't recognized until I saw her again, not as a wife, not as a mother, but as a woman who had written her legacy. Not in money or buildings, but in the decisions made when no one was watching. The video slowed, the images faded, and then came something I hadn't seen, not even once, not even in my most private moments with her. Things, a recording. The camera wobbled slightly before settling, and there she was. Evelyn, weaker, thinner, but radiant. Her voice, once firm, now trembled, but not from fear. From the weight of what she had to say. "If you're watching this," she began, "I'm likely not around anymore. But I needed to speak for myself, because some things are easier heard than read. I want to thank my husband for standing, for enduring, for not letting my absence make him small. And I want to say this clearly, without bitterness but with truth. Our legacy is not for those who mock grief, not for those who laugh at sorrow, not for those who sit at tables meant for love and bring poison. My name, my memory, the life we built, it should go to those who know how to carry it with grace, not grind it into ash." There was no need for explanation. Everyone in the room had heard the story, or parts of it. The birthday lunch had made its rounds, gossiped in whispers, dissected with discomfort. The daughter who said her father should have died instead. The family that laughed. The man who didn't. No names were mentioned, but names weren't needed. The silence that followed Evelyn's words was so complete. I could hear someone's breath hitch to rows ahead. When the lights came back on, no one applauded, not out of disrespect, but because applause felt too small. People sat quietly, some with tears streaking their cheeks, others with heads bowed, and I, sitting in the back with my hands folded over my lap, felt something I hadn't felt since she passed. Not grief, not pride, not even justice, just peace. Charlotte wasn't there. I knew she wouldn't be. She wouldn't have been able to bear it, not because she felt remorse, but because she hated mirrors, especially ones that reflected who she really was. But word would reach her. It always did. The town was small enough, the stories fast enough, and when someone eventually showed her the video, whether out of cruelty or mercy, I imagined her face not twisted in anger, but in something far colder, the realization that her mother had chosen her words with surgical precision, and those words would live longer than her inheritance ever could. That night, as I left the gala, a few people stopped me, not to offer condolences, but to say thank you for sharing her, for letting them remember. I smiled, gently, and walked home alone, the cold air slicing cleanly through my coat, the stars above like tiny windows to a better place. Evelyn had spoken, and now the silence that followed wasn't the kind that wounds. It was the kind that heals. 2 weeks after the gala, the silence around Charlotte began to feel heavier, like wet wool draped across her shoulders. People who used to greet her in the bakery no longer made eye contact. The polite nods from neighbors dissolved into awkward glances. Even her friends, those who once found her wit charming and her defiance spirited, began to grow quiet in her presence. She mistook it, at first, for face small-town gossip, a storm that would pass. But as the days stacked into something harder, colder, and she found fewer hands to shake and fewer doors that stayed open, she turned her attention to something she thought could realign the world in her favor: the business. My late wife and I had built the store from nothing, back when our finances were more prayer than plan. Evelyn had managed the front with care, memorizing every customer's favorite item, greeting children by name, offering discounts before anyone had to ask. I handled the back inventory, suppliers, the quiet work that didn't require a smile but demanded precision. It had started as a florist shop, then evolved into something harder to categorize. We sold seasonal goods, hand-carved ornaments, preserves made by local women, candles Evelyn made by hand. Over time, it became a fixture in town, a place where people lingered, not to buy, but to feel human again. Charlotte had shown no interest in it while Evelyn was alive. She mocked the smell of lavender and beeswax, hated how the register stuck, loathed the way customers told long stories at checkout. But now, with the inheritance gone and public sympathy rotting in her hands, she saw the business as her last stronghold. She walked in on a Thursday. I know because the new owner called me minutes later, her voice a mix of disbelief and amusement. Charlotte had arrived in a rush, wearing expensive boots and that fake smile she used when trying to sell herself as someone generous. She spoke loudly, greeting customers like she owned the place, calling staff by the wrong names, inspecting shelves like a critic searching for flaws. She made it clear this was hers. Her mother had run it, her father had funded it, and now, by logic twisted around entitlement, it should fall to her. That was when the new owner stepped forward. Julia had once been an employee, young, quiet, always cleaning the corners no one noticed. Charlotte had humiliated her once, years ago accused her of stealing a glass pendant that had, in truth, slipped between display drawers. Evelyn defended Julia, apologized to her in public, then promoted her the following week. After Evelyn passed, I found Julia's name again, not in a resume or a business proposal, but in a journal Evelyn kept during the final year of her life. She seized the details Evelyn had written. The smallest kindnesses mattered to her. If our work must live beyond me, let it live in hands like hers. I honored that, quietly, thoroughly, legally. The shop had been transferred 6 months before Evelyn's passing. Julia now owned it outright. The records were clean, the deed notarized, the transition planned with a grace Charlotte could never have understood. Inside the store, a new plaque had been mounted above the register. Charlotte didn't notice it until she was halfway through her tantrum. She read it once, then again, then stood still, as if the sentence might somehow reverse if she stared long enough. It read, "For those who build, not those who destroy." Dedicated to Evelyn Harper. Charlotte left without saying a word. The door's bell jangled behind her like a punchline. I don't know what she did afterward. Maybe she drove around. Maybe she screamed in her car. Maybe she cried for a version of herself that no longer existed. But I know she didn't return. She couldn't. Some spaces remember kindness and others cruelty. And this one had chosen what it would hold on to. That night, I walked past the shop myself. The windows were glowing softly with candlelight. Inside, A little girl picked out a pressed flower bookmark while her father waited patiently. Julia stood behind the counter, offering a sample of marmalade. No one noticed me watching, and I liked it that way. I had no desire to own again what was now better in someone else's hands. It was enough to know that the things we built in love did not die with the one who first dreamed them. They survived not in bloodlines, but in purpose. Not in inheritance, but in intent. Charlotte, I imagine, will wake the next day still clinging to some hope, searching for something left to claim. But the truth was becoming clearer with each door that closed in her face. She hadn't just lost money. She hadn't just lost control. She had lost the right to call anything ours. And in a town that knew the difference between presence and legacy, that loss was the only one that mattered. The phone rang just after midnight. I was still awake, sitting in the den where Evelyn used to knit beside the fireplace. Though the yarn had long stopped unwinding, the logs crackled low, and my tea had gone cold, but I didn't move. The house had settled into its nightly quiet, that peculiar silence that only comes in the absence of someone who used to breathe beside you. I glanced at the caller ID and felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected: curiosity. It was Emma, Charlotte's older sister, my other daughter, the one who never picked sides out loud, who never challenged nor defended, who simply existed between us like Switzerland with dimmer lighting. I answered. She didn't start with hi, didn't bother with small talk or apologies for the hour. She just said, "She came to my door tonight." I leaned back and closed my eyes. Of course she did. Emma's voice had always been steady, the kind that teachers loved and her mother trusted. Even as a child, she had a silence that spoke more than most people's declarations. When Charlotte had lashed out at Evelyn in those later years, when the sarcasm curdled into spite and the visits became transactional, Emma stayed quiet. She didn't approve, but she didn't interfere. She helped Evelyn to bed after chemotherapy appointments and restocked the fridge without fanfare. And when I once asked her why she never told Charlotte off, she simply said she wouldn't hear me, but maybe someday she'll feel it. That night, on the phone, she said Charlotte had shown up unannounced. Tears smeared over her face, too proud to admit they were real. She had yelled first, then begged, accusing us both of betrayal, of manipulation, of ruining her life over a joke. Emma didn't raise her voice once. She let her sister flail in the storm of her own making, then invited her not to forgive, not to soothe, but to finish something that had long been unfinished. I pictured them in Emma's kitchen, that narrow room with chipped tile and warm light, sitting across from each other at the table their mother once used to braid their hair. Emma told her everything, about the will, the letters, the business, the shelter, the fund, the journal entries, about the documents she had helped notarize, the meetings she had attended with me, the plans she had made to honor Evelyn's legacy. Charlotte sat frozen. She said, not from disbelief but from realization. Somewhere, beneath all the noise and arrogance, she had always known she wasn't trusted with the future. Emma hadn't done it out of malice. She had done it because someone had to. You mocked everything she built, Emma told her, and you laughed the day she should have been honored. So we honored her the only way we could, by making sure your laughter never echoed in her name again. I said nothing as Emma recounted the conversation. I didn't need to. She wasn't calling for validation. She was simply passing the torch of acknowledgement. At the end of it, her voice softened. She asked me if there's anything left that's still hers, Emma said. I told her, just her name, and that too will fade if she keeps carrying it the way she does. I sat there long after the call ended, the fire reduced to glowing coals. My daughters, two halves of a legacy, one hollowed by vanity, the other fortified in silence. I wondered how Evelyn would have felt knowing that it was Emma who ultimately stood firm, who spoke last when the noise had finally died down. Outside, the wind picked up, pulling leaves across the porch in restless patterns. I thought of the years that had slipped by, the birthdays celebrated with warmth and laughter, the ones that passed with forced smiles and tension sharp enough to slice cake. I remembered Evelyn once saying, "It's not the loud ones who break your heart. It's the quiet ones who hold the glue when everything else falls apart." She had been right, as always. And now, Emma was doing what I could not have done alone. She wasn't just reinforcing my decisions. She was making it clear to Charlotte, with the authority only a sister can wield, that this wasn't revenge. It was preservation of memory, of love, of dignity. The next morning, I received a letter in the mailbox. No return address, just my name, scribbled in Charlotte's handwriting. Inside was a photograph, one I hadn't seen in years. It was of Evelyn, holding both girls in her arms, seated on the garden bench behind our old house. Charlotte looked defiant, barely smiling. Emma was resting her head against Evelyn's shoulder. On the back, in faint pencil, Charlotte had written, "I don't remember this day, but I want to." I placed a photo on the mantel beside Evelyn's urn, not as an olive branch, not as forgiveness, but as evidence that even those who hurt us most are capable of remembering what they once forgot to love. It was not a grand publication, the kind of paper that sits unread in waiting rooms and gets tossed into driveways at dawn. But for those who still turned the pages with ink-stained thumbs, it carried something that no viral tweet or clipped video could. Wait. The article appeared on a Wednesday, tucked between a feature about a retired fire chief and an op-ed on school lunches. Its headline was almost quiet in tone, almost too gentle. When your child becomes your bully. There were no names, no direct references, just a story, plainly told, about a man who had spent a lifetime building a family, only to watch it splinter under the weight of a daughter's laughter at the wrong time, in the wrong place, for the wrong reasons. I didn't write it with revenge in mind. I wrote it because silence, for all its uses, had limits, and because stories, when stripped of their characters' names, tend to reveal the reader more than the subject. It began with a recounting of a birthday, not mine, not hers. My late wife's. A lunch turned awkward, then cruel. It moved into memory. How grief can be interrupted by mockery. How a smile can go deeper than a knife when it comes from the one person you're raised to understand. Empathy. It spoke of years of small humiliations disguised as jokes, inheritance treated like a game board, affection used as leverage. It told of what I had done, not just the will or the letter or the transfer of the house, but the decision to remove legacy from blood and place it instead into hands that remembered how to hold without squeezing. And throughout, the article lingered not on condemnation but on sorrow. It wasn't a courtroom testimony. It was an obituary for a relationship buried long before any funeral. I didn't expect it to spread, but someone read it, and then someone else. And soon a neighbor mentioned it while watering her garden. Then a man at the post office tapped the counter a little longer than usual and said, "I think I read something of yours." The air began to shift, not dramatically, not with torches or applause, but with small recalibrations. People who once waved politely at Charlotte now crossed the street, or changed lanes. Invitations stopped driving. Her once curated image, the poised, successful daughter with a sharp wit and sharper tongue, began to crumble beneath the surface tension of unspoken recognition. They didn't say her name, but they didn't have to. The woman who laughed when her father mourned was now the woman everyone quietly remembered not to become. Emma told me later that Charlotte had called her in a fury. "How could he write that? Everyone's looking at me like I'm a villain." Emma had simply replied, "He never said your name, so why are you so sure it's about you?" I imagine Charlotte staring into silence after that, confronted not just by what I had done, but by the fact that truth doesn't need permission to exist. It only needs to be told once. I received a letter a few days after the article was printed. Not from Charlotte, not from Emma, but from a stranger, a woman in her 70s, who had lost her son to distance and derision. She wrote in cursive, the ink faded in some places. The words honest and heavy. Thank you for writing what so many of us feel, but are too ashamed to say. That love has limits. That cruelty, when worn too long, becomes a uniform. And that some apologies arrive too late to matter. I placed the letter in the same drawer where I kept Evelyn's last birthday card to me. The one where she had drawn a little bird in the corner and written, "Still watching, still proud." The article changed nothing in the legal sense. Charlotte still had no claim to the estate, no access to the fund, no seat at the table she had once assumed would always be set for her. But it changed the air around her, and that, I think, was worse in her eyes. Reputation was her currency, and silence, once her tool, had become the echo that followed her into every room. Now, when she entered a cafe or sat in church, she felt it, the hush, the glance, the unspoken knowledge that laughter, once unleashed carelessly, had consequences that did not ask permission to bloom. I didn't write the article to shame her. I wrote it to remind myself that I still had a voice, and that Evelyn's story, our story, deserved to end with dignity, not with a cruel punchline. And in doing so, I had returned something that Charlotte had long since taken from me without asking: the power to tell the truth, even if it meant telling the world that sometimes the deepest betrayal doesn't come from enemies. It comes from those we once rocked to sleep. It came late one evening, the sort of hour when the sky has already turned black and the only light left comes from the quiet pulse of a phone screen. The message preview flashed once, then faded. I didn't touch it at first. I just sat there in the chair Evelyn used to call your thinking throne, surrounded by the gentle clutter of a life once shared. Her favorite scarf still draped over the armrest, a book she never finished sitting spine-worn on the shelf. The silence in the house had changed over the last few months. It wasn't hollow anymore. It was honest. And that message, that flicker of desperation, was an echo I had learned to live without. Eventually, I opened it. I didn't mean it like that. "Please, let's talk." No punctuation, no apology, just 6 words, suspended between injury and performance, like a net thrown too late to catch a fall that had already happened. I read it once, then again, as if repetition might extract some hidden sincerity from the cracks between her vowels. But the truth was clear. She hadn't written it out of love or remorse. She had written it because the world had stopped clapping when she walked into a room. She had lost the inheritance. She had lost the house. She had lost the business, the trust, the reputation she had once wielded like a blade. And now, stripped of all those ornaments, she reached not for me as a father, but for the scaffolding of an image she wanted back. A man to forgive her publicly, so that others might forget privately. I imagined her typing those words with her jaw tight, her eyes starting to see if anyone else had seen the notification. It wasn't a confession. It was damage control. And I had no interest in repairing something that had been broken by design. I didn't reply, not out of cruelty, not out of pride, but because some words don't deserve answers and some apologies only exist to absolve the speaker, never to heal the listener. Evelyn would have understood. She believed in grace, yes, but not in letting pain dress up as reconciliation just because it arrived on trembling legs. For years, I had tried to hold my tongue, to play the quiet role of the grieving patriarch, to believe that family could stretch around any cruelty, so long as it bore the same last name. But grief, I've learned, has a voice of its own, and that voice had waited long enough. That night, I placed my phone face down and lit the candle Evelyn always liked to burn in the evenings. The scent of sandalwood filled the room, and for a moment I felt her again, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a presence. Strong, clear-eyed, tired of being spoken over. In that silence, I found something that no message could undo: peace. Charlotte would send others. I knew she would. Maybe another text, Maybe a call from a new number. Maybe even a carefully orchestrated visit with crocodile tears cupped in her palms. But each attempt would arrive too late, because she hadn't just mocked my grief that day at the lunch table. She had severed something deeper. She had stood over the memory of her mother and laughed like it was a party trick. And while everyone else chuckled or stared awkwardly at their plates, she alone held the match that set the bridge ablaze. I would not walk across those ashes just to shake her hand on the other side. I had found new purpose in the ruin. The foundations of our family had cracked, yes, but from those fractures rose something sturdier. Evelyn's name on a shelter door, her smile framed on the wall of a community scholarship office, her voice, eternal now, played at a gala where strangers wept not out of obligation, but out of recognition. That was the legacy I had chosen. And legacies, I've come to learn, are not built on forgiveness alone. Sometimes they're built on silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than revenge. The kind that reminds those who mock love that its absence has weight. So I left the message unanswered, not deleted, not ignored, just acknowledged and set aside, like an artifact from a time I had no interest in returning to. Because grief had taught me something more powerful than anger. It had taught me clarity. And in that clarity, I knew that this wasn't just about a lunch or a will or a letter. This was about who I would be for the rest of my life. A man who buried his wife with dignity, who reclaimed his voice from the ones who tried to rewrite his sorrow into comedy, and who, in the end, learned that some doors should remain closed. Not out of hate, but out of love for the silence that waited behind them.